In the corridors of history, there are moments when a familiar narrative begins to feel strangely unstable. Not because of a sudden discovery or a dramatic revelation, but because something long accepted no longer sits comfortably in the mind. A detail lingers. A scale feels wrong. A question, once noticed, refuses to fade. What if some of the most celebrated images of the past were never meant to be art alone, but something closer to testimony? In the mid-18th century, a series of engravings emerged from Rome that continue to unsettle historians, architects, and archaeologists alike. They are usually introduced as masterpieces of imagination, exercises in dramatic exaggeration, or expressions of Baroque theatricality. Yet the longer we look, the more fragile those explanations become. These images do not invite admiration alone. They provoke unease. They suggest memory rather than fantasy. And they quietly challenge what we think we know about the ancient world. The name attached to these works is Giovanni Battista Piranesi, an Italian engraver born into the family of a stonemason, a man who understood stone not as an abstract form, but as weight, resistance, and permanence. His engravings, often grouped under the grand title of Roman views, depict vast architectural remains scattered across the city and its surroundings. Colossal arches rise into empty skies. Staircases ascend beyond practical reach. Vaulted halls stretch into darkness, their ceilings lost high above any human scale. Against these structures, human figures appear almost incidentally, reduced to tiny silhouettes whose only function seems to be measurement. They do not animate the scene. They emphasize how little they belong in it. Official history tells us that this was deliberate exaggeration, an artistic choice meant to glorify Rome's ancient past and impress European patrons hungry for ruins and romance. But this explanation begins to fracture under sustained attention. These engravings are not celebrations of grandeur. They are records of collapse. Walls are split open, columns lie broken, foundations sink beneath layers of earth and debris. Vegetation forces its way through marble, as if reclaiming something abandoned long ago. Piranesi does not draw cities at their height. He draws them after something has already gone terribly wrong. This raises a disturbing possibility. If these images were meant as fantasies, why are they so relentlessly focused on destruction rather than creation? Why does nearly every scene feel like the aftermath of an event rather than a dream of the past? And why is the architectural logic within these ruins so internally consistent, so structurally convincing, that it resists being dismissed as mere invention? As we begin this investigation, we are not searching for spectacle. We are examining evidence, quietly and carefully. The engravings of Piranesi have become central to discussions about mysterious ancient architecture, the hidden history of Rome, and even the idea of a lost advanced civilization erased from the conventional timeline. Within the broader conversation about an ancient civilization catastrophe, these images occupy an uncomfortable place. They are too precise to ignore and too inconvenient to fully explain away. Consider the scale alone. The dimensions implied by these structures go far beyond what would have been necessary for the civic or ceremonial functions attributed to them. Doorways resemble triumphal arches. Steps rise higher than a person's waist. Bridges span chasms wide enough to accommodate entire processions with ease. Light, in many scenes, would struggle to reach the floor from the heights suggested above. These are not isolated artistic flourishes. They form a pattern that repeats again and again across hundreds of plates. The usual response is reassurance. We are told that artists have always played with proportion, that drama demands excess. But this reassurance grows thinner the longer one looks. Piranesi was not careless with detail. His perspectives are mathematically rigorous. His shadows obey consistent light sources. His ruins interlock with a coherence that suggests observation rather than imagination. If this is fantasy, it is an unusually disciplined one. And then there is the mood. These engravings are heavy with silence. They do not feel like nostalgic reconstructions of a glorious past. They feel like landscapes after evacuation. The human figures wander, measure, or rest, but they never dominate. They appear as later occupants, not creators, as if they arrived long after the original purpose of these structures had already been forgotten. What we are seeing, perhaps, is not an artistic meditation on ancient Rome, but a visual archive created at a moment when the scars of some earlier devastation were still visible, not yet fully buried, not yet fully explained. Piranesi lived in a time when Rome itself was layered, its streets raised above earlier streets, its buildings resting on foundations whose origins were already obscure. He did not invent this condition, he recorded it. This is why his work continues to attract those searching for forgotten ancient technology, for signs that the past may have been more complex than our textbooks allow. His engravings sit at the intersection of art, archaeology, and something harder to name. A persistent sense that we are looking at evidence without fully understanding the event that produced it. So we begin with a simple, unsettling question. What if Piranesi was not imagining the ruins of a distant antiquity, but documenting the remains of a world that had already collapsed before history had finished rewriting itself? What if these images are not romantic exaggerations, but fragments of a memory that civilization has struggled to accommodate? To answer that, we must first understand what history officially says Piranesi was doing, and why that explanation has been so carefully preserved. Only then can we begin to see where it starts to fail. To understand why these images have been framed so carefully as art rather than evidence, we have to step back into the intellectual climate of the 18th century and examine the story that history itself tells about their creator. The official narrative is orderly, reassuring, and complete. It leaves little room for discomfort. According to accepted scholarship, Giovanni Battista Piranesi was a product of his time, an architect by training, an engraver by profession, and a passionate admirer of ancient Rome. Born in 1720, he arrived in the city during an era when ruins were not only abundant, but fashionable. Europe's elites were captivated by antiquity. Travelers on the Grand Tour wanted souvenirs of the ancient world, and Rome supplied them in abundance. Broken temples, half-buried forums, and fragments of imperial ambition scattered across a living city. In this version of events, Piranesi's mission was clear. He was to record, interpret, and dramatize these remains, for an audience eager to see Rome not as it was, but as it felt. His engravings are described as vedute, views designed to inspire awe rather than accuracy. The dramatic lighting, exaggerated perspectives, and monumental scale are explained as artistic devices, tools meant to elevate emotion over measurement. Rome, we are told, was his stage, and exaggeration was his language. This explanation is tidy. It allows historians to admire Piranesi without taking him too seriously. His works become aesthetic artifacts rather than historical documents. They are admired for their mood, their composition, their technical mastery, but gently separated from any obligation to be true. In this framing, the ruins are symbolic. They represent the idea of antiquity, not its physical reality. The timeline reinforces this comfort. Rome in the 18th century was undergoing constant transformation. Ancient structures were dismantled for building materials. Streets were raised to manage flooding. Foundations were reused, reburied, and repurposed. Archaeology, as we understand it today, did not yet exist as a formal discipline. Excavations were often unsystematic, driven by construction needs rather than historical curiosity. In such a setting, inconsistencies could easily be explained away as confusion, romanticism, or error. Piranesi, according to this view, was not documenting a lost world, but rearranging one. He took fragments of real ruins and recombined them into imaginative compositions. His prisons, his endless staircases, his impossible spaces are labeled inventions, psychological landscapes rather than physical ones. Even his more realistic Roman views are said to be selectively distorted, heightening scale and drama to satisfy patrons and personal taste. Yet embedded within this official narrative is a subtle contradiction. While historians insist that Piranesi exaggerated freely, they also emphasize his obsession with accuracy. They note his meticulous measurements, his insistence on studying ruins firsthand, his frustration with other scholars who, in his opinion, misunderstood Roman engineering. He wrote treatises defending the technical superiority of Roman construction. He criticized those who reduced ancient architecture to mere decoration. This creates an unresolved tension. On one hand, we are told that his images cannot be trusted as records. On the other, we are reminded that he devoted much of his life to precise documentation, measurement, and argument. These two characterizations do not sit easily together. An artist unconcerned with truth does not typically wage scholarly battles over structural details. The official explanation attempts to resolve this tension by drawing a line between Piranesi the thinker and Piranesi the image maker. His writings are treated as serious. His engravings are treated as expressive. But this separation is an assumption, not a demonstrated fact. It relies on the belief that visual evidence is inherently less reliable than text, even when produced by the same hand. There is another aspect of the accepted story that deserves attention. We are told that Piranesi worked within the limitations of his era, using traditional engraving techniques and relying on manual labor and observation. His productivity is praised as remarkable but not impossible. His workshop is described as busy but manageable. The sheer volume of his output is attributed to discipline and genius. And yet, even within conventional biographies, there is an unease about the scale of his work. Hundreds of large, complex plates, years of excavation, measurement, writing, and architectural commissions. All accomplished within a single lifetime. The numbers are presented, but rarely interrogated. They are facts that sit quietly on the page, waiting for someone to ask what they actually imply. For now, official history prefers not to ask. It offers an interpretation that smooths over rough edges and preserves continuity. Piranesi becomes a bridge between antiquity and modernity, not a challenge to the timeline itself. His ruins are safe because they are imaginary. His scale is harmless because it is symbolic. But this safety depends on restraint. It depends on not looking too closely at the details, not comparing image to image, not asking why certain patterns repeat with such consistency. The moment we move beyond admiration and into analysis, the explanation begins to strain. And this is where the first cracks appear. Because when we stop treating these engravings as isolated artworks and start viewing them collectively, as a body of evidence rather than a gallery of impressions, something changes. The exaggerations begin to look systematic. The distortions begin to follow rules. If Piranesi was merely indulging in fantasy, then his fantasies were strangely disciplined. And discipline, when repeated often enough, stops looking like imagination. It starts to look like record keeping. To see why that matters, we must turn away from biography and intention and look instead at what is actually depicted on the page. Not as art, but as structure. Not as mood, but as measurement. That is where the next layer of the mystery begins to reveal itself. When the discussion shifts away from intention and biography and toward what is actually present within the images themselves, the tone of the investigation changes. We are no longer asking what Piranesi meant to do. We are asking what his engravings show, repeatedly, insistently, and without variation. This is where the first layer of anomalies becomes impossible to ignore. The most immediate and unsettling feature is scale. Not occasional grandeur, not symbolic monumentality, but a consistent, overwhelming mismatch between architecture and the human body. In engraving after engraving, people appear not as participants, but as markers. They stand beside staircases that rise higher than their heads with a single step. They rest near columns whose bases dwarf entire groups. They cross bridges so wide and thick that their original purpose seems incompatible with pedestrian use. These figures do not animate the space. They do not converse, gesture, or command attention. They exist solely to tell us how large everything else is. And the message is unmistakable. Whatever these structures were designed for, they were not designed with ordinary human proportions in mind. This observation becomes more striking the longer one looks. The proportions are not chaotic. They follow internal logic. Staircases are steep, but consistently so. Doorways are enormous, but uniformly enormous. Vaults are high, but not arbitrarily. The exaggeration, if that is what it is, obeys rules. And rules imply reference points. In architectural fantasy, scale tends to fluctuate according to emotional emphasis. One scene overwhelms, another relaxes. But here, the sense of human smallness is constant. It does not peak for dramatic effect and then subside. It persists across scenes, locations, and compositions. The viewer is never allowed to feel at home. Equally important is how these spaces would have functioned. Many of the structures depicted appear finished, not conceptual. The stonework is precise. The joints align. The load-bearing elements make sense. These are not sketches of ideas, but images of completed systems. And yet, their dimensions exceed what would be reasonable for ceremonial, residential, or civic use as we understand it. Take the staircases. In functional architecture, stairs exist to connect levels efficiently. Their rise and run are constrained by the human gait, but in these engravings, steps rise to the chest. Climbing them would require effort bordering on the impractical. Multiply this across an entire building, and the structure becomes hostile to the body. This is not design negligence. It is designed for something else. The same is true of interior spaces. Halls stretch so high that light seems swallowed before it can reach the ground. Openings intended to admit daylight are placed far above where illumination would be useful. If these spaces were meant for people, they would have been dim, cold, and inefficient. Yet the architecture itself shows no sign of incompletion or error. It is coherent, intentional, and monumental. At this stage, no explanation is being offered. We are not naming builders, cultures, or technologies. We are simply acknowledging what is there. A pattern of proportions that consistently minimizes the human presence. A built environment that treats people as temporary occupants rather than intended users. What makes this particularly difficult to dismiss is repetition. These features are not confined to one series or one moment in Piranesi's career. They appear in Roman views, in interior fantasies, in prison-like constructions, and in depictions of open ruins alike. Different subject matter, same proportional language. The official response is familiar. We are told that scale was manipulated to evoke the sublime, to inspire awe through contrast. This explanation has merit, up to a point. Artists have long used scale symbolically, but symbolism usually exaggerates selectively. Here the exaggeration is systematic. If the goal were simply to make Rome feel grand, why not occasionally restore balance? Why not allow a space where humans feel appropriately sized, where architecture serves them rather than overwhelms them? The refusal to do so suggests that the imbalance itself is the subject. Another detail reinforces this impression. The people in these engravings rarely interact with the architecture in meaningful ways. They do not ascend the stairs. They do not pass through the massive doorways. They stand, sit, or measure. They appear tentative, as if navigating an environment that was not built with their comfort in mind. This subtle narrative choice matters. It suggests a temporal disconnect. These people are not inhabitants, they are visitors. Later arrivals, trying to interpret remnants of something older and larger. Their presence feels provisional. When this is combined with the evidence of destruction already noted, the collapsed arches, the buried levels, the fractured columns, a quiet implication begins to form. These structures may not simply be oversized. They may belong to a different phase of occupation altogether. But before drawing any conclusions, another question must be asked. If these buildings were not designed for the people depicted, then who were they designed for? And if that question feels premature or uncomfortable, it is worth noting that it arises naturally from the images themselves, not from speculation imposed upon them. At this point in the investigation, we are still dealing only with observation, scale, proportion, human relationship to space. No theories, no causes, just patterns that repeat with an almost mechanical consistency. And those patterns lead us toward a second, deeper contradiction. Because when we examine not just the size of these structures, but the way they have failed, the manner of their destruction, the story becomes even harder to reconcile with gradual decay or artistic license. The next clue does not lie in how big these buildings were, but in how they came apart. When attention moves from size to damage, the tone of the evidence shifts again. Large structures can be explained away as exaggeration. Ruins, however, tell stories of forces. Stone remembers how it fails. And in the engravings before us, the manner of failure is unusually consistent. These are not buildings gently worn down by centuries of neglect. They are not the romantic fragments produced by slow erosion, casual dismantling, or localized conflict. What Piranesi shows again and again is abrupt collapse. Arches do not merely crack, they shear and fall inward. Vaults do not sag gradually, they cave in as unified sections. Columns are not chipped or reduced. They are snapped, sometimes cleanly, as if subjected to stresses far beyond their design limits. Equally striking is where this destruction occurs. Damage is not concentrated at obvious weak points, such as joints exposed to weather or surfaces accessible for stone removal. Instead, entire structural systems appear compromised. Supporting walls are broken, while decorative elements remain strangely intact. In some scenes, massive blocks lie scattered, as though displaced rather than dismantled. This pattern resists simple explanation. War leaves signatures, fire damage, impact scars, systematic demolition. Looting leaves others, missing stone, tool marks, selective removal. Time leaves yet another set. Rounded edges, differential decay, surface erosion. The ruins in these engravings do not align cleanly with any single category. One of the most revealing features is subsidence. Many structures appear partially swallowed by the ground itself. Lower levels are buried beneath thick layers of earth, sand, or debris, while upper sections remain exposed. In some cases, staircases descend directly into solid fill, not rubble, but compacted material that suggests deposition rather than collapse. This matters because gradual urban accumulation typically leaves a different signature. Cultural layers build unevenly. They preserve voids, pockets, traces of occupation. What is shown here feels heavier, more uniform, as though a large volume of material arrived in a relatively short span of time and then settled. Vegetation reinforces this impression. Trees grow from fractures high above what would have been the original ground level. Roots penetrate deep into stonework, splitting it from within. This is not early overgrowth on fresh ruins. It is the slow reclaiming of structures that had already been broken and partially buried long before the plants arrived. The sequence implied is unsettling. First, a violent disruption, then burial, then abandonment, then nature. Another subtle detail supports this reading. In several engravings, intact architectural elements appear directly adjacent to catastrophic failure. A perfectly preserved cornice sits above a void. A smooth wall abuts a collapsed interior. This suggests that the destruction was not uniformly distributed through time. It was uneven, sudden, selective. If these buildings had simply aged, we would expect the most exposed features to fail first. If they had been dismantled, we would expect systematic removal. Instead, what we see resembles structural trauma, as though forces acted upon entire complexes faster than human intervention could respond. And yet, the engravings do not depict chaos. There are no scenes of fire, no crowds fleeing, no visible violence. The catastrophe, whatever it was, has already passed. What remains is silence, a stillness that implies aftermath rather than event. This distinction is important. Piranesi does not show destruction in progress. He shows the world after it has been altered, when the dust has settled and the only witnesses are stone and shadow. This is consistent across his work. The moment of impact is absent. Only the result remains. The human figures reinforce this temporal distance. They do not behave like survivors in immediate danger. They behave like later occupants, measuring, resting, sketching, scavenging. They are calm, almost indifferent, as if the violence that shaped the landscape belongs to a past they did not experience firsthand. This introduces a troubling possibility. The ruins may not be ancient in the sense of gradual decay from classical antiquity. They may represent the remains of a system that failed abruptly and then lingered, half buried, into the era when Piranesi walked among them. At this stage, it would be premature to name causes. Earthquake, flood, subsidence, human intervention, all remain possibilities. But the scale and consistency of the damage suggest something beyond isolated incidents. The same kinds of failure appear across different sites, different structures, different contexts. What we are seeing may be evidence of a shared event, or at least a shared process, that affected the built environment on a broad scale. Not a single building collapsing, but a landscape transformed. This realization forces a re-evaluation of the familiar story. If these ruins were already this damaged when Piranesi recorded them, then the timeline of decay may be shorter and more dramatic than commonly assumed. The city may have undergone episodes of destruction that are no longer clearly recorded in written sources. Stone does not forget easily. When it breaks, it preserves the memory of stress, load, and failure. Piranesi's engravings, whether intended or not, preserve those memories as well. And once this perspective is adopted, another question arises naturally. If scale and damage follow patterns, then they may also relate to one another. The size of these structures and the manner of their collapse may not be independent observations. They may be connected. To explore that connection, we must stop viewing each engraving in isolation and begin looking for relationships between them. Only by placing these images side by side can we see whether they form a coherent pattern, or whether they truly are, as we have been told, nothing more than dramatic coincidence. When individual images are placed side by side, something subtle but decisive begins to happen. What once appeared as isolated curiosities starts to resolve into a pattern. Scale, damage, and burial are no longer separate observations. They interact. They reinforce one another. And together they suggest a shared underlying process rather than a series of unrelated artistic choices. Across different locations and subjects, the same relationship repeats. Massive structures sit partially submerged below the apparent ground level. Arches begin not at the earth, but beneath it. Staircases emerge from fill rather than foundation. In several engravings, what should be the lowest functional level of a building is already underground, while later human activity unfolds above, as if the city has been rebuilt on top of itself without fully understanding what lies below. This is not how gradual urban development typically presents itself. When cities grow slowly, layers accumulate unevenly. Older surfaces remain visible in places. Transitions are messy. Here, the transitions feel abrupt. The boundary between usable space and buried space is sharp, often cutting cleanly across architectural elements. Columns disappear mid-shaft. Walls vanish halfway up. Doorways are reduced to voids opening into compacted earth. What makes this especially striking is consistency. These features appear in different engravings, depicting different areas of Rome and its surroundings. They are not confined to one neighborhood or one building type. The same visual language repeats. Lowered ground levels, truncated structures, displaced stone resting where it does not belong. Once this is noticed, another detail comes into focus. The surviving human activity depicted in these scenes appears adapted to the altered landscape. People walk along raised paths that seem to follow the new surface, rather than the original design of the city. Temporary stairways and ramps appear where permanent access once existed. Ruins are reused as quarries, shelters, or boundaries, not as functioning architecture. This suggests a period of adjustment, a time when the original layout no longer made sense and had to be navigated rather than inhabited. The city is no longer operating as intended. It is being interpreted, improvised upon, and slowly forgotten. From this perspective, the engravings begin to resemble something other than artistic compositions. They start to look like snapshots of a city caught between eras, not fully ancient, not fully modern, a transitional landscape where remnants of a previous system coexist uneasily with newer forms of life. This is where logic begins to replace impression. If large volumes of material covered portions of the city in a relatively short time, then burial becomes understandable. If structures were already oversized, then partial survival above the new ground level becomes plausible. If collapse occurred before reoccupation, then the calm presence of later figures makes sense. No single engraving proves this on its own. But taken together, they point toward a sequence: construction on a monumental scale, abrupt disruption, widespread deposition, and gradual reoccupation. This sequence does not require myth or fantasy to function. It requires only that Rome, at some point before Piranesi's lifetime, experienced an episode of transformation more severe than the gentle decay usually implied. Whether through flood, subsidence, seismic activity, or another large-scale process, the built environment appears to have been reset. Within this framework, the engravings take on a different role. They become comparative documents. Each plate reinforces the others, not through repetition, but through alignment. They agree with one another in ways that would be difficult to maintain accidentally across such a large body of work. This is also where discussions of the hidden history of Rome and an ancient civilization catastrophe begin to intersect with visual evidence rather than speculation. The question is no longer whether Piranesi exaggerated. It is whether exaggeration alone can account for the structural coherence, the repeated ground-level shifts, and the consistent relationship between human scale and architecture. At this midpoint in the investigation, it is worth pausing to consider what is not being claimed. No specific date has been assigned. No cause has been named. No lost culture has been identified. What is being suggested is far simpler and far more difficult to dismiss. That the city Piranesi recorded was already the product of an earlier disruption that official timelines struggle to accommodate. If this is true, then Piranesi's role changes subtly but profoundly. He is no longer merely an interpreter of antiquity. He becomes a recorder of a landscape whose meaning was already obscured in his own time. His engravings preserve relationships between structures and ground that later restoration, excavation, and reconstruction would erase. This raises a new question, one that shifts our focus away from the images and toward the man who made them. What did Piranesi himself think he was doing? Was he consciously documenting these relationships, or was he simply recording what he saw without fully understanding its implications? To answer that, we must look beyond the finished plates and examine the traces of process, measurements, notes, and the working habits that shaped his output. Only then can we begin to see whether these patterns were accidental, or whether they were the result of deliberate observation by someone who sensed that the ruins around him were telling a story no one else wanted to read. To move beyond patterns in images, we have to approach the quieter evidence, the traces of method that sit behind the engravings themselves. This is where the story becomes less dramatic on the surface, but far more revealing in substance. Because whatever conclusions we may eventually draw, they must pass through one unavoidable question. How did Piranesi work? The accepted portrayal emphasizes him as an engraver of exceptional imagination. Yet, the surviving record describes a man preoccupied with measurement, accuracy, and argument. He did not simply sketch ruins in passing, he measured them. He returned to the same sites repeatedly. He compared proportions, annotated details, and debated contemporaries who disagreed with his interpretations of Roman construction. This matters because it reframes his engravings as outputs of a process rather than spontaneous expressions. They were the final stage of something closer to fieldwork. And fieldwork leaves habits. Accounts from the period describe Piranesi conducting surveys among ruins that were already partially buried and difficult to access. He documented foundations exposed by construction, recorded changes in ground level, and showed particular interest in substructures that others overlooked. While archaeology as a discipline did not yet formally exist, his approach resembles an early, unsystematic version of it. He was not alone in this. 18th century Rome was filled with antiquarians, collectors, and scholars. But Piranesi stood apart in his insistence that architecture should be understood structurally, not symbolically. He argued that Roman builders possessed technical knowledge superior to that of later cultures. This was not a popular position. Many preferred to view antiquity through a classical ideal stripped of engineering realities. His writings reveal frustration. He criticized those who reduced ancient structures to decorative shells, ignoring how they were actually built. He defended the use of massive materials and complex construction techniques as rational responses to specific conditions. In doing so, he implicitly acknowledged that scale and strength served purposes that could not be explained by aesthetics alone. This intellectual stance casts his engravings in a different light. If he believed that ancient builders were practical engineers, not mythical artisans, then exaggeration would undermine his own argument. Distortion would weaken the case he was trying to make. Accuracy, on the other hand, would strengthen it. There is also the question of repetition. Piranesi produced an extraordinary volume of work, not as isolated pieces, but as coherent series. The consistency of proportion, the recurrence of buried levels, the repeated emphasis on foundations and load-bearing elements all suggest sustained attention to specific features. These are not the elements an artist focused on atmosphere would prioritize. More telling still is what he chose not to emphasize. He rarely reconstructs buildings as they might have appeared in pristine condition. He does not fill in missing parts with idealized restorations. Instead, he leaves gaps. He shows damage. He allows absence to remain visible. This restraint is unusual in a period that favored imaginative completion over uncomfortable uncertainty. In several cases, his engravings preserve information that later restoration erased. As Rome modernized, ruins were cleared, ground levels lowered, and ancient structures recontextualized as monuments rather than remnants embedded in living strata. Piranesi's work captures the city before this process was complete, when contradictions were still visible on the surface. This temporal positioning is crucial. He was working at a moment when the past had not yet been fully reorganized into a coherent narrative. Layers overlapped, meanings were unstable. The city itself was an archive still in the process of being edited. From this perspective, his engravings function less like illustrations and more like snapshots taken before revision. They record relationships between structures and ground that later interpretations would smooth over. Whether he understood the full implications or not, he preserved evidence of discontinuity. At this stage, we are not yet proposing an explanation. We are establishing intent through method. A person who measures, records, and argues about structure is not casually inventing. A person who repeatedly depicts burial and collapse without offering reconstruction is not celebrating imagination. He is acknowledging something unresolved. This brings us to a critical transition. Up to this point, we have dealt with observation, pattern, and process. We have avoided interpretation. But evidence accumulates pressure. And at a certain point, refusal to interpret becomes its own form of distortion. The question now is not whether Piranesi exaggerated or whether Rome changed over time. Those are settled matters. The question is whether the scale, damage, and burial he recorded can reasonably be explained within the boundaries of gradual decay and artistic license alone. To move forward, we must allow ourselves to consider a hypothesis, not as a conclusion, but as a framework capable of holding everything we have seen so far without contradiction. Only then can we test whether it illuminates the evidence or collapses under its own weight. The next step is the most delicate one. It requires us to name the possibility that these engravings point toward a large-scale disruptive event in the past, and to examine whether such an idea explains more than it obscures. At a certain point in any investigation, restraint becomes a liability. Patterns accumulate, observations align, and what began as cautious description demands a provisional explanation, not because certainty has been reached, but because silence can no longer account for what is visible. This is that moment. The hypothesis that now emerges does not begin with myth, nor does it require speculative civilizations or lost sciences to function. It begins with a simpler, more disciplined proposition that the built environment Piranesi recorded had already been shaped by a large-scale disruptive event before his lifetime, one that altered ground levels, damaged structures abruptly, and forced later populations to adapt to a transformed landscape. This is not a claim of total annihilation or global collapse. It is the suggestion of a severe episode, natural or combined in nature, that exceeded the capacity of ordinary urban decay to explain. A disruption large enough to bury lower levels, fracture monumental architecture, and leave behind a city partially erased yet still standing. Within this framework, the anomalies we have observed begin to align without strain. Oversized structures no longer need to be exaggerated fantasies. They become remnants of a system built to different requirements, now only partially visible. The consistent burial of foundations becomes the result of deposition rather than neglect. The calm presence of later human figures makes sense as post-event occupation rather than survival. Crucially, this hypothesis does not require us to know who built these structures or why they were built at such scale. It requires only that something interrupted their use. A sudden shift in environmental conditions, a catastrophic flood, massive subsidence, a compound event involving seismic activity and sediment movement. The specific cause remains open. The pattern does not. Under this lens, Piranesi's engravings resemble documentation rather than interpretation. He is not reconstructing a glorious past. He is recording a damaged present. His focus on collapse, burial, and disproportion becomes explanatory rather than aesthetic. He is showing what remained after function had been stripped away. This also explains his apparent reluctance to complete or idealize the ruins. Reconstruction would have imposed a narrative that the physical evidence did not support. Instead, he allows ambiguity to persist. He shows structures that no longer make sense because they no longer serve their original purpose. The hypothesis further accounts for the strange neutrality of his human figures. They are not heroic inheritors. They are cautious occupants. They measure, observe, and repurpose. Their relationship to the architecture is exploratory rather than authoritative. This is consistent with a population living among the remains of a system it did not create. Importantly, this interpretation does not stand alone. It resonates with what we know about Rome as a stratified city, built and rebuilt over layers of earlier occupation. Written sources acknowledge repeated flooding, seismic disturbances, and ground-level changes. What they rarely do is integrate these events into a coherent visual narrative. Piranesi's engravings may be doing precisely that, unintentionally preserving a synthesis that textual history left fragmented. The strength of this hypothesis lies in its economy. It explains scale, damage, burial, and reoccupation with a single underlying process rather than a series of unrelated excuses. It does not dismiss artistic intention, but it reorders it. Piranesi's skill becomes a tool for preservation rather than invention. At the same time, this hypothesis remains provisional. It does not claim that every engraving is a literal record, nor that Piranesi fully understood the implications of what he was recording. It suggests only that his work is more consistent with observation than fantasy, and that the landscape he depicted was already abnormal in ways that standard explanations struggle to accommodate. If this is correct, then Piranesi occupies a new role in the history of Rome. He becomes a chronicler of discontinuity, someone working at the edge of two narratives, one that sought to romanticize antiquity, and another that quietly revealed its fractures. His engravings become a bridge between physical evidence and historical silence. But a hypothesis, no matter how elegant, must be tested. It must withstand skepticism. It must be compared against alternative explanations and measured against what we know from other sources. Otherwise, it risks becoming just another story layered atop the ruins. In the next stage of this investigation, we will do precisely that. We will confront the most common objections to this interpretation, examine what it explains well and where it strains, and bring in additional evidence that either strengthens or weakens the case. Only by doing so can we determine whether this hypothesis clarifies the engravings, or whether it collapses, like so many of the structures Piranesi drew, under the weight of its own assumptions. Any interpretation that challenges a familiar historical frame must pass through skepticism, not as an obstacle, but as a necessary filter. If the hypothesis of a large-scale disruptive event is to hold, it must explain the evidence more convincingly than the alternatives that already exist. Otherwise, it deserves to be set aside. The first and most common counter-argument returns to artistic exaggeration. Piranesi, critics argue, was deliberately amplifying scale to evoke the sublime. The 18th century valued emotional impact. Vastness overwhelmed the viewer and elevated ruins into symbols of lost greatness. Within this view, disproportion is not evidence, but intention. At first glance, this objection appears reasonable, but it weakens when examined against consistency. Artistic exaggeration typically fluctuates. It bends reality where emphasis is desired and relaxes elsewhere. In Piranesi's work, the imbalance between human scale and architecture is nearly universal. It does not rise and fall with dramatic needs. It persists across subject matter, medium, and decade. If exaggeration were the goal, variation would be expected. Instead, we find uniformity. A second objection focuses on restoration bias. Critics suggest that what Piranesi depicted were transitional conditions, ruins in the midst of neglect that later generations would repair, excavate, or stabilize. According to this view, the engravings capture disorder simply because order had not yet been imposed. This explanation acknowledges an important truth. Rome has been heavily altered since the 18th century. Many structures Piranesi drew have since been cleared, reinforced, or recontextualized. But this does not negate the evidence. It heightens its value. His engravings show conditions before systematic intervention. They record relationships that later restoration erased. The question is not whether Rome changed, but why so many structures required such extensive redefinition in the first place. Another counterargument appeals to gradual accumulation. Flooding, debris, and rebuilding over centuries, we are told, can bury lower levels and create the appearance of abrupt change. This process, known and documented, is often invoked to explain stratification in ancient cities. Yet gradual accumulation produces irregularity. It creates pockets, slopes, and inconsistencies. What Piranesi shows is often different: clean truncations, uniform burial lines, and repeated ground-level shifts that cut across unrelated structures. These features are easier to reconcile with rapid deposition than with slow accretion. There is also the argument of selective depiction. Perhaps Piranesi chose dramatic ruins because they sold better, ignoring more mundane scenes of decay and continuity. This commercial motivation cannot be dismissed outright. He did sell his work. He did appeal to patrons. But commercial incentive does not explain his focus on foundations, substructures, and damaged load-bearing elements, features unlikely to excite casual buyers. Nor does it explain his relative indifference to reconstructive fantasy. Many artists of his time eagerly completed ruins in the imagination. Piranesi rarely does. He leaves gaps unresolved. A more subtle objection concerns interpretation drift. Once viewers begin to look for catastrophe, they may see it everywhere. Patterns can be imposed as easily as discovered. This is a valid caution, and it underscores the importance of restraint. This is why the hypothesis does not rely on any single engraving or dramatic example. It rests on repetition across a large body of work. It emerges not from isolated shock, but from accumulation. Each engraving adds a small weight. Together, they tip the scale. To test this further, we can look beyond Piranesi. Other contemporary artists and early antiquarians recorded Rome in similar transitional states, though often with less emphasis on structure. Their works, while less systematic, do not contradict his. They reinforce the sense of a city layered and unsettled. We can also compare his engravings to later archaeological findings. Excavations have repeatedly revealed buried streets, submerged floors, and reused foundations at depths inconsistent with purely gradual processes. While these discoveries are often discussed individually, Piranesi's work presents them visually as a connected phenomenon. At this point, the hypothesis does not claim certainty. It claims coherence. It organizes disparate observations into a single explanatory framework that aligns with physical evidence, historical context, and artistic practice. This is where discussions of ancient civilization, catastrophe, and the hidden history of Rome quietly re-enter the conversation, not as sensational claims, but as interpretive tools. They allow us to ask whether discontinuity deserves more attention than continuity in our reading of the past. Skepticism remains essential. Alternative explanations must stay on the table. But skepticism cuts both ways. It applies not only to new ideas, but to old comforts. When a familiar explanation requires increasing complexity to account for mounting anomalies, it too must be questioned. What Piranesi offers, intentionally or not, is a challenge to linear storytelling. His engravings resist smooth progression. They show interruption, adaptation, and partial forgetting. They ask us to consider whether history, like architecture, sometimes collapses and is rebuilt on uneven ground. As we move toward reflection, the question is no longer whether this hypothesis is provocative. It is whether it allows us to see the evidence more clearly than we could before. And if it does, then its value lies not in the answers it provides, but in the perspective it forces us to adopt. Because once we accept that civilizations can suffer abrupt dislocations, events that fracture continuity and leave behind confusing remnants, our understanding of the past changes. Not dramatically, but fundamentally. The ruins stop being decorative backdrops. They become unresolved questions, and it is with those questions, rather than conclusions, that we must now step back and consider what this means for how we remember, preserve, and interpret the traces of worlds that came before us. When the debate over evidence and counter-evidence begins to settle, what remains is not a verdict, but a change in perspective. This is the quiet consequence of inquiry that rarely appears in conclusions or footnotes. It is the moment when familiar landscapes no longer feel stable, when ruins cease to be decorative reminders of the past and become questions directed at the present. If the engravings of Piranesi truly capture a city already shaped by disruption, then they invite us to reconsider how civilizations endure, not as continuous arcs of progress, but as fragile systems subject to interruption, loss, and reinterpretation. History, in this light, is not a straight line. It is a palimpsest, written over again and again, each layer partially erasing the last. Rome offers an ideal case study for this reflection. It is often described as eternal, yet its physical form tells a different story. Streets rise above streets. Buildings stand on buried buildings. Daily life unfolds atop foundations whose origins are rarely questioned. Continuity is assumed, but continuity may be an illusion created by survival rather than stability. Piranesi's engravings confront us with this illusion. They show a city that has outlived its own explanations. Structures remain, but their purpose is no longer clear. Scale persists, but function is gone. People move through spaces they did not design, adapting rather than inhabiting. This is not simply a historical condition, it is a human one. Across civilizations, this pattern repeats. Great systems fall, not always dramatically, but decisively enough that their logic cannot be reconstructed by those who follow. Knowledge fragments, meanings shift. What was once central becomes ornamental. What was once functional becomes mysterious. The implications extend beyond Rome. If even a civilization as well documented as the Roman world contains unresolved breaks in its physical record, then less documented cultures may conceal even deeper discontinuities. The absence of written testimony does not imply the absence of events. It often reflects the priorities of those who survive to write. This is where metaphor becomes unavoidable. Civilizations resemble structures more than stories. They are built to withstand certain loads, certain stresses. When forces exceed those limits, collapse follows predictable patterns, regardless of intention or belief. Afterward, what remains is reused, reinterpreted, and gradually misunderstood. In this sense, Piranesi's work becomes less about Rome and more about memory itself. His engravings capture a moment when the past had not yet been fully organized into a narrative that made sense. They preserve ambiguity. They resist closure. And in doing so, they remind us that certainty is often a retrospective construction. There is also a humbling implication here. Modern observers tend to view themselves as the inheritors of accumulated knowledge, standing at the peak of a long ascent. But the ruins suggest a different posture, one of humility, of provisional understanding, of recognition that what we see may be incomplete. This does not diminish human achievement. It contextualizes it. It suggests that progress is not guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost as easily as gained, and that material evidence often outlasts the stories meant to explain it. Stone remembers what text forgets. The small human figures in Piranesi's engravings take on renewed significance in this light. They are not symbols of insignificance. They are symbols of continuity. They represent survival after disruption, adaptation after loss. They move carefully through a world whose scale exceeds their understanding. Yet they persist. This perspective reshapes how we approach ruins today. Not as puzzles to be solved quickly, nor as backdrops for nostalgia, but as incomplete records demanding patience. The question shifts from, what did this mean, to what happened here that we no longer fully remember? Such questions are uncomfortable because they destabilize authority. They suggest that historical narratives are not final, but provisional, that archives are selective, that absence can be as meaningful as presence. In this broader frame, the discussion of an ancient civilization catastrophe or a hidden history of Rome is less about uncovering a single dramatic event and more about acknowledging structural vulnerability. Civilizations can falter. Records can break. Memory can fragment. What Piranesi offers, intentionally or not, is a reminder of this fragility. His engravings are not warnings etched in stone, but reflections captured on copper. They ask us to look closely, to resist easy explanations, and to accept that the past may be more complex than the stories we tell about it. As we approach the end of this investigation, the temptation is to seek resolution, to name causes, to assign dates, to close the case. But perhaps the more honest response is restraint, because the value of Piranesi's work does not lie in the certainty it provides, but in the questions it preserves. And those questions, once asked, do not remain confined to Rome. They extend outward, toward every ruin, every buried foundation, every trace of a world that once made sense to someone else. The final task, then, is not to answer everything, but to decide how we carry this uncertainty forward, whether we allow it to deepen our understanding, or whether we rush to replace it with comfort. In the end, every investigation reaches a quiet edge, not a revelation that resolves all doubt, but a point where the evidence stops speaking clearly and begins to whisper instead. This is that edge. The engravings of Giovanni Battista Piranesi do not offer us a single decisive answer. They do something more subtle, and perhaps more unsettling. They reveal a past that does not fit neatly into the timelines we have grown accustomed to trusting. They show us architecture without context, scale without explanation, and destruction without a named cause. And they do so with a consistency that resists dismissal. If there is a conclusion to be drawn, it is not that history is false, but that it is incomplete. The physical record preserved in stone and copper suggests interruptions, moments when continuity broke and had to be reassembled by those who came after. In that sense, the ruins Piranesi recorded are not anomalies. They are reminders. It is tempting, when faced with such reminders, to rush toward certainty, to label the event, to assign a date, to identify a culprit. But the evidence does not allow that with confidence. While there is enough material to suggest a large-scale disruption in Rome's past, there is not enough to responsibly declare its precise nature. And restraint here is not weakness. It is fidelity to what the record actually permits. What we can say is this: Piranesi was not merely decorating the past. He was preserving it at a moment when its meaning was still unstable. His choice of medium, his emphasis on structure over spectacle, and his refusal to reconstruct what he could not verify all point toward a mindset closer to archiving than invention. His copper plates endure not because they are imaginative, but because they are stubbornly precise. In modern discussions about mysterious ancient architecture, forgotten ancient technology, and the ancient civilization catastrophe implied by buried cities and fractured monuments, his work continues to resurface for a reason. It occupies a narrow but powerful space between art and evidence. It cannot be easily absorbed into either category without losing something essential. This is also why his engravings remain relevant to conversations about the hidden history of Rome. They capture a city before restoration softened its contradictions, before excavation isolated its layers into orderly sequences. They show Rome as a palimpsest, still in the process of being overwritten. The human figures wandering through these scenes linger in the mind. They are not heroes, conquerors, or builders. They are observers, much like us. They stand among structures they did not create, attempting to measure and understand what remains. Their presence bridges centuries, reminding us that every generation inherits a world already shaped by forces it did not witness. Perhaps this is the most enduring lesson. Civilizations do not vanish cleanly. They leave behind fragments, structures too large, too complex, too damaged to fully explain. Later, societies adapt to these fragments, build atop them, and eventually weave narratives that make the inheritance feel coherent. Over time, the gaps are forgotten. Piranesi's engravings resist that forgetting. They do not accuse, they do not explain, they simply show. And in doing so, they ask us to reconsider our confidence in linear progress and uninterrupted memory. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with questions rather than answers. Questions about how often history has been reset without being fully recorded. Questions about how much knowledge can be lost while structures remain. Questions about whether the past we recognize is only the portion that survived reinterpretation. In the study of Giovanni Battista Piranesi engravings of Roman ruins, and of the possibility that they record the aftermath of an ancient civilization catastrophe, the most responsible conclusion may be an open one. Not a declaration, but an invitation. An invitation to look longer. To compare images rather than isolate them. To treat ruins not as symbols, but as data. And to accept that sometimes the most important truths are not the ones that close a story, but the ones that keep it alive. Because the moment we stop asking what these ruins truly represent is the moment they become decorative again. And perhaps that is the one thing Piranesi never intended them to be.